The letter carrier knocked on the door at 14 o'clock sharp, as usual. I opened the door, took the registered letter, and signed for it on his clipboard. The young man nodded and left, and I was left standing on the threshold, holding the envelope with the official stamp. The sender's address was unmistakable, the law firm of Baxter and Associates. My heart thudded, but I forced myself to remain calm. I went into the living room, sat in my favorite chair by the window, and carefully opened the envelope. Subpoena. The plaintiff is Casper Drake, my only grandson. The subject of the action is the invalidation of real estate transactions made by the defendant in a state where he could not understand the meaning of his actions. The trial date is November 15th, 3 weeks from now. I put the papers on the table and looked out the window. Beyond the glass was my garden, which I had cherished for 30 years. The old apple trees my late husband Alfred had planted, the fall chrysanthemums along the path, the neatly trimmed boxwood bushes. This house on Maple Street became my world after Alfred's death. It's where I raised Casper when his parents died in a car accident. This is where my grandson and I spent our summer vacations, reading books, baking cookies, and now he wants to take this house away from me. The sound of a lawnmower outside my window distracted me from my dark thoughts. Walter the neighbor was cutting the grass in front of his house. A man in his 60s, a widower like me. We sometimes talked over the fence, exchanging gardening tips. He'd seen how Casper had changed over the years, and he'd hinted more than once that I should be more careful with my grandson and his wife. The house creaked, as it always did on windy days. The sounds were as familiar to me as my own breathing. Each floorboard, each rung of the stairs had its own voice. Alfred had once said that the house was alive, that it had a soul. I had thought it sentimental nonsense at the time, but the years had taught me to realize that the house did have a life of its own, a memory of those who had lived in it. I got up and walked through the rooms. The living room with the fireplace and the antique armchairs we'd inherited from Alfred's parents. The dining room with the solid oak table where we ate lunch every Sunday as a family me. Alfred, our son Thomas and his wife, and little Casper. A kitchen with blue tiles that I chose myself, dreaming of the breakfasts I would make for my children and grandchildren. I went up to the second floor and went into Casper's room. It hadn't changed much since he'd moved out. The same narrow bed, the same desk by the window, bookshelves with his favorite adventure novels. There was a picture hanging on the wall, a picture of Casper and me at his high school graduation. He's 18, smiling happily, his arm around my shoulders. I look at him with pride and love. Where is that boy now? Thelma, a tall, skinny blonde with sharp facial features and cold blue eyes. She had come into Casper's life 5 years ago when he was 32. She worked as a secretary at the construction company where he worked as a project manager. Beautiful, ambitious, flattering, and charming. Casper lost his head immediately. I remember the day he brought her to my house. It was a Sunday, early May, and the tulips were blooming in the garden. Casper was nervous, adjusting his tie, but Thelma was as confident as if she were the lady of the house. She looked around the rooms with a keen eye, appraising the antique furniture, the paintings on the walls, the silver candlesticks on the fireplace. She smiled sweetly, but her eyes remained calculating. "What a lovely house!" she exclaimed as she entered the living room. "Casper told me about it, but I didn't realize it was so big and beautiful." "Thank you, dear," I replied. "My husband and I spent many years organizing it." "How many rooms are there?" Thelma asked, and there was a strange note in her voice, as if she were taking an inventory. 6 bedrooms, 3 baths, living room, dining room, kitchen, office, I listed, plus an attic and a basement. Thelma nodded, as if recording the information in her mind. Then she started asking about the garden, whether it was large, whether there was a garage, when the house had last been renovated. She said she was interested in architecture, but I could see she was interested in something else. At dinner, Casper announced his intentions. Grandma, I want to marry Thelma. She's a wonderful woman, and we're perfect for each other. You've only known her for 3 months, I said cautiously. Maybe we should wait, get to know each other better. Thelma put her hand on Casper's shoulder and smiled softly. Cordelia, I understand your concerns. But when you meet your soulmate, time doesn't matter. I love Casper very much, and I want to make him happy. Casper looked at her with loving eyes. He had always been a romantic, believed in great love, in fate. After his parents died, when he was only 12, I became both mother and father to him. I tried to give him the best: education, care, warmth of the family hearth. I sent him to a good private school, then helped him pay for university. Casper studied engineering, dreamed of building houses. Maybe she overprotected him from the hardships of life. As a result, he grew up to be a kind but naive man. What about yourself, Thelma? I asked. Casper says that you work in the same company. Yes, I'm the director's secretary, she replied. But it's only temporary. I have plans for the future. I want to get a management diploma, start my own business. That's interesting. Where did you grow up? Thelma hesitated for a moment, then answered, In Ohio. Small town, not much to tell. My parents died early, and I lived with my aunt. Then she passed away too, and I moved here to Leipzig. Do you have any other relatives? Unfortunately, no. I'm all alone, Thelma said sadly. That's why Casper's family is so important to me. I hope we can be friends, Cordelia. It was a sad story, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Too convenient, no family, no one who could tell me about her past. I was also confused by how quickly she'd gone from crying about being an orphan to asking about the family assets. The wedding was 6 months later, a small celebration in a restaurant for about 30 guests, mostly friends and colleagues of the young, since Thelma, according to her, had almost no relatives. She looked spectacular in her white dress. Casper was glowing with happiness. I tried to rejoice with them, but anxiety never left me. At the wedding, I met a few of Thelma's friends. They seemed strange to me, too noisy, vulgar, with bright makeup and provocative outfits. One of them, a red-haired girl named Crystal, squinted at me all evening and whispered something in Thelma's ear. Then I overheard them talking in the ladies' room. So this is the granny with the house? Crystal asked. Quiet? Thelma hissed. Yeah, that's her. She must be rich, huh? She is. The house alone is worth a fortune. I bet she's got savings and insurance. You're a real piece of work, Tell. I always knew you couldn't miss. I hurried away before I'd heard the rest of the conversation. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had misunderstood something. After the wedding, the couple rented an apartment in the new neighborhood of Leipzig. Casper still came to see me every weekend, helped around the house, talked about work. We planted flowers, repaired the fence, read in the evenings on the veranda. He seemed happy, though sometimes I could see the tiredness in his eyes. How are things with Thelma? I'd ask him. Fine, he answered, but not convincingly. She's working hard, taking management courses. She's very determined. Gradually, his visits became less frequent. At first, he explained it by busyness at work. Then, the fact that Thelma is not feeling well and needs his support. And then he came once a month, but only for a short time. Thelma thinks you need help with the household, he said one day. The house is big. The garden needs tending. Maybe you should think about moving to a smaller apartment and sell this house and put the money in the bank with interest. Casper, this house is my life, I answered. Here your grandfather built our family. Here you grew up. I'm not going to sell it. But it's too big for you alone, he insisted. and it's expensive to maintain. Heating, electricity, taxes, repairs. My pension and savings are enough. It's enough now, but what will be next? You're getting old, Grandma. You may need medicine, medical care. He didn't insist at the time, but I could see that the subject bothered him. A few months later, Thelma came to visit me. It was Saturday morning. I was watering the flowers on the veranda when I saw a familiar car in the gate. Thelma stepped out of the car with a box in her hands. She was wearing an expensive coat I hadn't seen before, a new purse, gold earrings. "Cordelia!" she exclaimed with a wide smile. "How are you? I baked an apple pie. Thought you might enjoy it." We sat down in the kitchen and I made tea. Thelma asked about my health, praised my flowers, recalled funny stories from work. It seemed like she was genuinely trying to be nice. But then the conversation took a different turn. "Cordelia, Casper is very worried about you," she said, taking a bite of pie. "You live alone in such a big house. Anything can happen. You could fall, hit yourself, and there's no one to help you. The neighbors are far away. Will they hear a cry for help?" "I'm all right, darling. I'm not a wreck yet." Of course, of course," Thelma agreed hastily. "You look fine, but still, at your age, you have to be careful. And this house needs constant maintenance. The roof's old, the heating's bad. It costs a lot of money to fix it. I can manage for now." "Maybe you should consider your options," Thelma continued. "There are wonderful homes for the elderly, there and nurses, and entertainment programs. And the money from the sale of the house can be spent on something nice, traveling, for example." I realized where the conversation was going and decided to end it. "Thelma, I'm grateful for your concern, but my plans for the future are fine with me." She left with a strained smile, and a week later, Casper arrived in a different mood. He spoke sharply, irritated. He accused me of stubbornness, of not listening to reasonable advice. "Grandma, you're getting old," he said harshly. "You need care, not this old wreck. The house needs repairs. The heating is bad. The roof leaks. How much is all this going to cost? What if something happens to you?" "Casper, where is this anger coming from?" I asked. "You never said that before." "I didn't realize how serious it was before," he replied. Thelma opened my eyes. She was a nurse. She knows what happens to the elderly. That was news to me. As far back as I could remember, Thelma had always said she was a secretary, but I didn't say anything. "I don't want you to suffer in this house," Casper continued. "You deserve a peaceful old age." "Who says I'm suffering?" I mean, anyone can understand. You're alone. The house is huge. You have a lot of problems." Casper left without saying goodbye, and I was left to sit in an empty house and think about how my boy had changed. There was nothing left of the child I'd raised, the one who used to bring me bouquets of dandelions and tell me about his childhood dreams. For the past 2 years, our relationship had been deteriorating. Casper rarely came to visit, called even less. When we did see each other, he would always talk about selling the house, about my moving, about how I needed help. Sometimes he'd come with Thelma, and then the atmosphere would get especially heavy. She would sit there with a sour face, looking at her watch, and then she would rush her husband. "Casper, we have to go. I have an important meeting tomorrow," and I stubbornly refused their offers. Not because I was a stubborn old woman, but because I saw who was behind those words. Thelma no longer pretended to be a kind daughter-in-law. She was coldly polite when meeting, but I could sense her impatience. She wanted me out of their lives as soon as possible, leaving behind only an inheritance. And now they had decided to proceed through the courts. I picked up the summons again and read each line carefully. They accused me of being unable to understand the meaning of my actions and demanded to recognize all the transactions I had made over the past year as null and void. What transactions? The only thing I'd done was make a will in favor of a charity organization for homeless animals. But they couldn't have known about that. Or could they? I got up and walked to my office, a small room next to the living room where Alfred had once worked with documents. I opened the old safe where the important papers were kept. The will was there, neatly folded in an envelope. Next to it was another folder that I had been saving for 3 years. It was its contents that I was going to use if things went to extremes. It looked like that time had come. Casper had come to me 25 years ago, on a rainy October evening. He was 12, having just lost his parents in a car accident on a highway near Toledo. My son Thomas and his wife Susan were returning from a friend's wedding anniversary when a drunken truck driver rammed their car. They were killed instantly. I remember every detail of that day. The phone call at 11:30 in the evening, the voice of the policeman breaking the terrible news, the feeling that the world was falling apart, that nothing would ever be the same again. Alfred sat next to me on the couch, holding my hand, and I thought of only one thing. Casper, who had been orphaned and now needed us more than anything else in the world. The boy came to us 3 days after the funeral, skinny, pale, with huge brown eyes full of unspoken grief. He was carrying a worn backpack with all his belongings and the teddy bear his mother had given him for his birthday. Casper was silent, answering questions with one-word answers and clutching the toy in his hands. "This is your home now," I told him then. "Grandpa and I will take care of you." He nodded, but didn't look up. The first weeks were hard. Casper didn't sleep well, often woke up screaming, refused to eat. I spent long hours with him, reading books, telling stories about his father as a child. Gradually, the boy began to thaw. Alfred turned out to be a wonderful grandfather. He taught Casper to work in the garden, fix a bicycle, play chess. On weekends, they built birdhouses together in the garage or went fishing on Lake Erie. The boy loved these trips, came home ruddy and happy, with stories of caught fish and funny incidents on the water. Things were going well in school. Casper was an able student, especially excelled in math and drawing. Teachers noted his diligence and responsibility. He made friends, Todd Miller, who lived next door, and Jake Wilson from the parallel class. The boys spent time in our garden, built huts, played soccer on the front lawn. Casper grew up a kind and sympathetic child. He helped the elderly Mrs. Kramer from the house across the street to carry her shopping, fed the stray cats who lived in the alley behind our street. When he was 15, he started working part-time as a newspaper delivery boy to save money to buy us presents for the holidays. "Why would you do that?" I asked. "You have everything you need." "I want to earn money for a bicycle myself," he replied seriously. "And for your birthday, I will buy beautiful earrings." Alfred died when Casper was in his second year of university. A heart attack, sudden and ruthless. My grandson and I buried him in November, in the cold rain. Casper cried as he hugged me and promised he would never leave me. "You are the only one I have left, Grandma," he whispered through his tears. "I'll always be there for you." And he kept his word. Casper came every weekend, despite his workload at the university. He helped around the house, fixed things, just sat with me, and talked about his business. After graduation, he took a job with Hamilton Construction, started as an assistant engineer, and gradually worked his way up the ladder. At 28, he bought his own apartment in downtown Leipzig, but he continued to visit me regularly. We had lunch together every Sunday, discussing his work, my chores, and news in town. Casper talked about his projects, a shopping center on the northern edge, a new apartment complex near the university. "Maybe it's time for you to find a nice girl," I sometimes asked. "When I meet the one and only one, I'll know right away," he replied with a smile. "Like Grandpa and you." He had short affairs, but nothing serious. Casper was demanding of women, looking for someone special. He dreamed of a big love, a family with the same warmth as Alfred and me. And then Thelma came along. It was the winter of 2019. Casper came to me on Sunday, excited, with burning eyes. "Grandma, I've met her," he announced from the doorstep. "The one I had dreamed of all my life." "Tell me," I asked, pouring him tea. "Her name is Thelma. She works in our company as a secretary to the director. Beautiful, smart, interesting." We talked at lunchtime, and I realized that she was my destiny. Casper talked about her with the enthusiasm of a discoverer. How Thelma smiles, how she laughs, what her eyes are like, how she takes an interest in his work, asks intelligent questions about construction projects, how they'd eat lunch together in the little cafe near the office and talk into the evening. "She's very well read," he continued. "She knows literature, history. She also had a hard childhood, being left alone early. But she didn't harden, on the contrary. She became stronger." "How old is she?" 29. She's about my age, and she wants to meet you. Can you believe it? She says family is very important to her. I was happy for him, but I told him to take his time. Casper was always impulsive. He could get carried away and miss the obvious. But he was so happy that I did not dare to cloud his joy with doubts. The first meeting with Thelma, as I said, was in May. She gave the impression of a well-bred, educated woman, but there was something about her that made me suspicious. Too calculating, too many questions about home and family wealth. But Casper glowed with happiness, and I decided to give her a chance. The next few months flew by quickly. Casper introduced Thelma to his friends, took her to theaters and restaurants, planned their future together. He told me every detail of their relationship, how they chose furniture for his apartment, how Thelma taught him how to cook lasagna, how they dreamed of a wedding trip to Europe. "She works so hard," he said with admiration. "She wants to succeed in life. She's not going to sit on my neck. Already enrolled in management courses, plans to open her own business." "What kind of business?" "I haven't decided yet. Maybe a real estate agency, maybe a consulting firm. She's got a knack for it. She's bound to succeed." Thelma did seem like an ambitious woman. When I met them together, she told me about her plans, about the courses she was taking, about the business books she was reading. She spoke intelligently, confidently, but again, she focused too much on material matters. "Casper told me that you and your husband built this house by yourselves," she once said at dinner. "You must have invested a lot of money." "We've been saving for years," I said evasively. "And these houses are expensive now, especially in this neighborhood, which is considered prestigious." "I don't think about the price. It's my house." "Sure, sure," Thelma agreed hastily. "Just wondering how the real estate market is developing. I want to work in this field." But that wasn't the only thing that surprised me. Thelma often contradicted herself in small things. Then said that she grew up in a small town in Ohio, then mentioned her childhood in the suburbs of Cleveland. She told me that the aunt she lived with was a teacher, or that she worked as a nurse. Perhaps her grief had clouded her memory, but it seemed to me that she was simply forgetting her stories. I also noticed that Casper started to change, not all at once, gradually. He came less often, talked less about his business. Sometimes he seemed tired, anxious. He answered questions briefly, without the same openness. "Is everything all right?" I asked him. "Of course, Grandma. It's just a lot of work right now." But I sensed it wasn't just work. Casper seemed to be under some kind of pressure, and Thelma became more and more insistent in asking about our family, about the house, about my plans for the future. The wedding took place 6 months after we met. Casper insisted on the celebration, although I suggested waiting a little longer. Thelma supported his desire to get married sooner, explaining that she didn't see the point in a long engagement. "Why drag it out?" she said. "We already know we want to be together for life." At the wedding, I met Thelma's friends for the first time. A motley group of 5 women of different ages, united, as it seemed to me, not so much by friendship as by common interests of a material nature. They were evaluating the restaurant, discussing the cost of the banquet, making plans for future meetings. The red-headed Crystal, the most talkative of the group, spent the entire evening trying to get details about the family's wealth out of me. She asked about Alfred's job, his pension, whether we had savings and insurance. "Thelma says you have a beautiful house," she chirped. "It must be very expensive, huh?" "It's priceless to us," I replied diplomatically. "Yes, yes, of course, but I still wonder how much a house like this might be worth on the market. My parents are thinking of moving too. They want to buy something similar." I was just making generalities, but Crystal was persistent. I was also struck by a conversation I overheard between her and another friend of Thelma's, a brunette named Charlotte. "What a mess Tell was in," Crystal giggled. "He's not a bad guy, though, a hard worker." "But Grandma's got money," Charlotte said. "Tell always knew how to get a good deal. Do you remember how she went out with that Ricardo? Also because of his parents' money." "Yeah, but it didn't work out. And this one got lucky." This conversation is making me uncomfortable. So Thelma's had a history of finding lucrative partners, and my grandson was just another attempt to improve her financial situation? But Casper seemed so happy that day. He danced with Thelma, smiled at the guests, made plans for their honeymoon. Was it all an act on his wife's part? Or did she really have feelings for him? Just mercantilism was stronger. After the wedding, the young went on a trip to Italy. Casper sent postcards from Rome, Florence, Venice. He wrote enthusiastically about the sights, about the local cuisine, about how good they are together. And Thelma, judging by his stories, was constantly photographed against the background of expensive stores and luxury hotels. On their return, they settled in Casper's apartment. Thelma immediately began to rearrange, bought new furniture, changed curtains, updated appliances. All this cost a lot of money, and Casper, telling me about the updates, looked a little puzzled by the scale of spending. "She says she wants to make our house cozy," he explained. And he was right, of course. The furniture was really old. "How's her job going?" "She's still at the same place, but she plans to quit soon, to start her own business." "With what money?" "Well, we have some savings. Plus, we can get a loan." I was worried about these plans, but I didn't want to spoil my relationship with my grandson. He was a grown man, entitled to make his own decisions, even if I didn't like them. The first year of their married life went relatively smoothly. Casper still came every weekend, although now often alone. Thelma usually found reasons to stay at home, whether it was a headache or an important meeting, or a management course that needed preparation. "She's very busy," Casper excused himself, "preparing to open a real estate agency." "And when does she plan to open it?" "Next year, probably. We still need to get a license, to find premises." But a year has passed, and no agency has not appeared. Thelma came up with all new excuses: that the market is not suitable, that the competitors are strong, that the paperwork is complicated. But spending in the family grew every month. Casper told about his wife's new purchases, about her desire to move to a more prestigious neighborhood, about plans to radically update the interior of the apartment. And that's when Thelma first talked about my house. The next morning, I called Wayne Parsons, the lawyer who had handled our family affairs during Alfred's lifetime. Wayne was a man in his 60s, with graying hair and shrewd gray eyes. He had known our family for years, helping with my husband's will, the paperwork for the house. I trusted him. "Cordelia," he said when I explained the situation. This is a serious matter. Come to my office and we'll discuss the details. Wayne's office was in an old brick building in the center of Leipzig. The receptionist ushered me into the office, where the lawyer was already studying a copy of the subpoena I had faxed to him. Tell me everything from the beginning, he asked, sitting me down in a comfortable chair across from his desk. When did the problems with your grandson begin? What could have triggered this lawsuit? I told him the story of the last few years without hiding anything, about how Casper changed after marriage, about Thelma's persistent attempts to force me to sell the house, about recent conflicts that were becoming more and more acute. Now think back to the most recent events, Wayne said. What had happened in the last few months? Perhaps something that triggered a lawsuit. I closed my eyes, replaying the painful episodes. The last 6 months had been particularly difficult. Casper came rarely, but every visit ended in a fight. Thelma had become even more insistent, no longer hiding her irritation at my unwillingness to sell the house. The March visit was particularly memorable. Casper came alone on a Saturday night. He looked tired, nervous. We sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, talking about the weather and neighborhood news. But I sensed that he was hiding something, mulling over his words. Grandma, we need to have a serious talk, he said at last, about your future. What future? You live alone in a big house. It's not safe, and it's expensive. Heating, taxes, repairs. Casper, we've talked about this many times, but you don't listen. He got angry. You're as stubborn as a child. I only want what's good for you. Good or good for yourself? The grandson's face reddened. What do you mean? Casper, I'm not blind. I see who's behind all this talk about my safety. Thelma has nothing to do with it. It's my decision, my thoughts. It's always Thelma when it comes to money. He got up from the table and paced the kitchen. You've disliked her from the beginning. You don't give her a chance. I gave her a chance, lots of chances, but the only thing she's interested in is our property. That's not true. Thelma is a kind, caring woman. She cares about you as much as I do. She cares about getting this house as soon as possible. Casper stopped, looked at me with pain in his eyes. Grandma, why do you think that about us? Do I look like the kind of person who would take your property? And at that moment, I felt my heart clench with pity. My grandson was really suffering. He was torn between his wife and grandmother, between love and greed, between his own feelings and other people's plans. Perhaps he didn't even realize who was controlling him. Casper, I don't think badly of you, I said softly. But your wife? Enough, he interrupted sharply. I won't let you insult Thelma. I'm not insulting, I'm just seeing what you don't want to see. What am I supposed to see? The way she's changed you? The way you've become a different person? Casper was silent for a few minutes, struggling with himself. Then he said quietly, I have to go. Thelma's waiting. He left, slamming the door, and I sat in the empty kitchen, thinking about losing my grandson forever. The next visit wasn't until May, and this time Casper came with Thelma. They showed up on a Sunday morning, unannounced. I was just watering the flowers in the garden when I saw their car at the gate. Thelma looked determined. She was wearing a business suit, her hair slicked back, a file in her hands. Casper kept behind her, clearly uncomfortable. Cordelia, we need to talk, Thelma announced without preamble. A serious talk about your situation. We went into the living room and sat in the armchairs. Thelma put the folder on the coffee table and opened it. Casper and I have thought a lot about your situation, she began, and we've come to the conclusion that we need to make some drastic decisions. What kind of decisions? You live in a house that is very expensive to maintain. You have a limited pension, and as you get older, you may need more money for health care. Thelma spoke businesslike, like a manager at a presentation. She pulled a calculator out of a folder and started naming numbers: the cost of heating, taxes, insurance, possible repairs. If you keep this up, you could be in financial trouble in 5 years, she concluded. But if you sell the house now, while the real estate market is favorable, you will get a solid sum. And what do you propose to do with it? Buy a small apartment or move to a nursing home with good conditions, and invest the rest of the money in income-generating instruments. Casper sat silently, studying the pattern on the carpet. I realized that this presentation was entirely Thelma's work, and that my grandson had simply agreed to support it. A very thoughtful plan, I said, but I'm not interested. Cordelia, be reasonable, Thelma insisted. We're not proposing it out of self-interest, but out of concern for you. Out of concern for ourselves, you mean? Thelma's face became rigid. I realize it's hard for the elderly to accept change, but sometimes relatives have to take responsibility. What responsibility? For your well-being, for your health, for the prudent management of the family estate. There was a threat in her words, barely veiled. Thelma was making it clear that if I didn't agree willingly, they would find other ways to get their way. Casper, I turned to my grandson, do you really think I'm incapable of controlling my own life? He finally looked up, and I saw the confusion in his eyes. Grandma, we're just worried. Answer me straight. Do you consider me incompetent? No, of course not. It's just, it's just that we see problems that you don't see. What problems? Well, the house is really too big. And the money? You gotta think about the future. Did Thelma teach you to talk like that? Casper blushed, and his wife intervened in the conversation. Cordelia, your attacks are inappropriate. We want to help you make the right decision. And if I don't want to make your decision, then we'll have to consider other options. I knew what that meant. They threatened to take me to court, to declare me incompetent, to force me to forfeit my property. Thelma was willing to go that far to achieve her goals. They walked away with nothing, but I knew it wasn't over. Thelma is not the kind of person who gives up after the first failure. She would look for other ways, more radical ways. In June, another unpleasant episode happened. I went to the bank to update my will and add an animal charity to the list of heirs. It was my way of making sure that after I died, at least some of the money would go to a good cause and not to Thelma's whims. But when I got to the bank, I got an unpleasant surprise. The account manager, a young woman named Jennifer, greeted me with a concerned look. Mrs. Crane, we have a problem, she said. Your grandson called last week. He said you might be making some reckless financial transactions. What? He asked me to notify him of any major spending or changes in his will. He said he was concerned about your mental state. I felt the blood rush to my temples. Casper was trying to control my finances through the bank. It was humiliating and outrageous. Jennifer, I said, trying to stay calm, I've been a customer of this bank for 30 years. I have all the documents to prove my legal capacity, and I forbid you to share my account information with anyone without my written authorization. Of course, Mrs. Crane, we were just thinking. Don't think. Just follow my orders and mine alone. I made the changes in my will, but the incident with the bank showed me how far Casper and Thelma were willing to go. They tried to create an atmosphere of doubt around me about my capacity, to prepare the ground for future legal actions. In July, the last serious conflict occurred. Casper came to my house in a state of extreme nervous excitement. He burst into the house without even knocking, which was unlike him. "Grandma, what have you done?" he shouted from the threshold. "Why did you rewrite the will?" "How do you know about the will?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that you're disinheriting your family for the sake of some stray animals. I realized that someone at the bank had informed them of the change, despite my inhibitions. Casper, it's my money and my house. I have the right to use it as I see fit. But I'm your grandson, your family. Is some organization more important to you than your own man? A family member wouldn't try to control my life against my will. I'm not. I'm protecting you from making rash decisions. Decisions that don't favor your wife, you mean? Casper stopped in the middle of the room, breathing heavily. There was pain mixed with rage in his eyes. Why do you hate her so much? He asked more quietly. What did she do to you? She stole my grandson from me, I answered honestly. She turned a good boy into a greedy man. I'm not greedy. I just want you to be okay. Then leave me alone. Let me live my life the way I think is right. Casper stood for a moment longer, struggling with himself. Then he turned abruptly and headed for the door. If you don't change the will, we'll go to court, he said over his shoulder. Prove you don't know what you're doing. Try it. After these words, he left, and we never saw each other again. 2 weeks later, I got a subpoena. So, said Wayne Parsons, after hearing my story, the picture is clear. They want to declare you incompetent so they can take control of the estate. It's a standard scheme, unfortunately. What are their chances? Not much if we prepare properly. You'll need a psychiatric evaluation, doctor's notes, witnesses to prove your sanity. And I have something else, I said, thinking about the documents in the safe. Information that could change the course of the case. Wayne looked at me carefully. What kind of information? I'll show you when the time is right. For now, let's focus on the standard defense. We discussed a plan of action, and I left the lawyer with the feeling that the battle was just beginning. Casper and Thelma had chosen war, and now they would have to face the consequences of their choice. On the morning of November 15th, I woke up at 7:30. Though my alarm clock had been set for 8, sleep had left me completely, as if my body realized the importance of the day ahead. Outside the window, it was drizzling rain, gray clouds hanging low over the roofs of the houses on Maple Street. The weather matched my mood. I got up, showered, and thought carefully about my outfit. I settled on the dark blue suit I'd bought for Alfred's funeral. Strict, respectable, it emphasized the seriousness of the situation. She matched the suit with a white blouse, small pearl earrings, and a black leather purse. The mirror reflected a woman who did not look like a feeble-minded old woman, unable to make rational decisions. At breakfast, I couldn't swallow half an omelet. My stomach clenched with nervous tension, though I tried to remain calm. I drank only a cup of coffee and sat for a few minutes in the silence of the kitchen, looking out the window at the garden. The chrysanthemums were almost in bloom, and the leaves on the apple trees were yellowing and falling in the rain. Autumn always made me sad, but this year it seemed especially merciless. At 9 o'clock, Wayne Parsons arrived. He looked confident and trim, wearing a dark suit and a conservative-colored tie. In his years as a lawyer, he'd learned to inspire confidence with just his appearance. "Ready, Cordelia?" he asked as he helped me into the car. "Ready," I replied, my heart pounding like crazy. On the way to the courthouse, Wayne instructed me again. Answer clearly and to the point. Don't let their lawyer confuse you. Remember, you are an able-bodied woman who has every right to manage her own property. And most importantly, maintain your dignity no matter what they say. The county courthouse in downtown Leipzig was an imposing gray stone structure with columns and wide steps. Built in the early 20th century, it was designed to inspire respect for law and order. These walls had once seemed to me a symbol of justice, but today they looked rather menacing. We climbed the steps and went through the metal detector. The foyer of the court was crowded. Lawyers with briefcases were hurrying about their business. Witnesses and participants in the trials were waiting to be summoned, and guards were keeping order. The air smelled of old wood, paper, and human excitement. Room 5, Wayne said, checking the paperwork. Judge Bridges will be handling our case. I knew Robert Bridges by reputation, a man of about 55, fair but strict. He did not tolerate demagoguery in his courtroom and demanded clear facts. That gave me some hope. We headed down a long corridor toward the courtroom. The walls were hung with portraits of former judges and prosecutors, their stern faces looking down at us from the height of their years and sentences. The polished parquet creaked under our feet, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. At the entrance to room 5, I saw them. Casper stood by the window, nervously rubbing the papers in his hands. He was dressed in his best suit, the dark gray I remembered from his wedding. His hair neatly combed, his face pale with excitement. When he saw me, he turned away, unable to meet my eyes. In that gesture was all the tragedy of our situation. A grandson who can't look into the eyes of the grandmother he has chosen to betray. Thelma was standing next to him, and her demeanor was strikingly different from her husband's. She was dressed impeccably, in a black dress of business style, complemented by a jacket and shoes with moderate heels. Her hair was gathered into an elegant style, and her makeup was professionally applied. Thelma looked like a successful businesswoman coming to an important presentation. But what struck me most was the expression on her face. There was no embarrassment or regret. On the contrary, her eyes were filled with anticipation of victory, barely concealed triumph. She studied me with a gaze that was cold and appraising, as if she were examining a commodity that would soon become her property. "Look who's here," she said loud enough for me to hear. "Our dear Cordelia in all her glory." The tone of her voice was mocking, almost mocking. She didn't hide her contempt now that it came to open confrontation. Their lawyer was standing next to them, a tall, thin, middle-aged man in an expensive suit. I didn't know him personally, but Wayne had warned me that Gerald Hawkins was known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to use any method to win. "Mrs. Crane," Hawkins addressed me with a polite smile that didn't affect his eyes. "I hope we can resolve all matters today in the best interests of the family." "In the interests of the family?" I interjected. "Or in the best interest of your clients?" "It's the same thing," he replied with the same cold smile. Thelma laughed softly. "God, she's trying to be formidable. She's like a caged lioness." Casper jerked as if her words had hurt him physically, but he remained silent. I realized that he was completely under his wife's control and didn't dare to object even to my outright insults. "Thelma, don't," he said quietly. "Why not?" she answered without lowering her voice. "We are here to help a poor old woman who can no longer adequately assess reality. It's an act of mercy on our part." There was not an ounce of sincerity in her voice. Every word exuded a poisonous sweetness, underneath which there was unconcealed greed. Thelma was enjoying the situation, taking pleasure in humiliating the woman who stood in the way of her goals. "Look at her," she continued, turning to her lawyer. 70 years old, living alone in a huge house that is falling apart before her eyes, rewriting her will in favor of some stray dogs. If it's not senile dementia, what is it? "Thelma," Casper said sharper, but his voice sounded more like a request than a demand. "Thelma what? I'm telling the truth. Your grandmother is sick, Casper, sick and stubborn, but we're going to help her whether she wants it or not." Wayne put his hand on my shoulder, warning me not to be provocative, but it was hard to hold back. Thelma's insolence was beyond anything I'd expected. She didn't even try to play the caring daughter-in-law, completely shedding her mask. At that moment, another group of people approached us. I recognized some of them. They were Casper and Thelma's neighbors, their work colleagues. Apparently, they had come as witnesses. Among them was the red-headed Crystal, Thelma's friend whom I remembered from their wedding. "Hi, Tell," Crystal chirped, kissing Thelma airily on the cheek. "So, are you excited?" "Not particularly," Thelma replied with a smug smile. "The matter is clear. The old woman is clearly not in her right mind. It's obvious to everyone who has talked to her." "How much did you say this house is worth?" "Realtors estimate about $400,000, plus savings, insurance. All in all, it's a pretty hefty sum. They were talking about me in the third person, like I wasn't even here, or as if I were an inanimate object, a piece of property to be divided up. It was humiliating and painful, but I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. "What about your grandson?" Crystal asked, glancing at Casper. "He's not exactly eager to fight." "Casper's a good boy," Thelma said condescendingly. "Too sentimental, but he knows it's best for everyone, including Cordelia herself." Of course," Crystal agreed. "Old people need care. They're like children. They don't know what's good for them." Casper stood aside, tense and silent. From time to time he cast quick glances at me, full of guilt and anguish. I could see that he was having a hard time, that he was agonizing over what was happening, but it wasn't enough to stop what was happening. "Attention," announced the bailiff. "Drake vs. Crane. Room number 5 is ready for the start of the trial." People began to make their way into the courtroom. Thelma led the way, standing straight and confident. She was clearly enjoying the moment, anticipating a quick victory. Casper followed her with his head down. Their witnesses followed in a group, talking softly among themselves. "Well," Thelma said, turning to me before I entered the hall. "We'll see how you do, Cordelia dear. Though frankly, the outcome is a foregone conclusion." "How can you be so sure?" I asked. "Because the truth is on our side," she answered with a cold smile. "You're a sick old woman who can't adequately manage her property, and we are caring relatives who want to help you." "Help ourselves, you mean?" "It's the same thing, dear, same thing." With these words, she entered the hall, and I followed her. The game had begun, and the stakes were extremely high. Thelma was certain of victory, but she was unaware of all the cards I had up my sleeve. The courtroom was furnished in traditional style. High ceilings, wood paneling on the walls, rows of public benches. Behind the judge's desk, an empty chair stood on the dais, waiting for Judge Bridges to arrive. To the left and right of the center aisle were tables for lawyers and their clients. Wayne and I took seats at the defendant's table. Casper, Thelma, and their attorney sat across from us. The witnesses were seated on the public benches. The room was quiet. Only the rustling of papers and muffled coughing could be heard. Thelma continued to show her confidence. She sat up straight, studied the documents, and from time to time whispered something to her lawyer. Her demeanor was that of a person who already considered herself a winner. She looked at me with ill-concealed triumph, as if to say, "Well, old lady, are you ready to give up?" Casper looked very different. He flipped through the pages nervously, avoided looking in my direction, and sighed deeply several times. At one point he turned his head toward Thelma, and I heard him say softly, "Maybe it's not too late to call it off. Make a family deal." "Don't be childish," Thelma replied sharply. "We've come too far to retreat." Besides, she brought the case to court by her own stubbornness. "But still, no buts," she hissed. "Do you want your grandmother to live the rest of her life in poverty? This house falling apart on her head? We're doing the right thing, Casper." He was silent, but I could see that he was having doubts. Perhaps, deep down, he knew the meanness of what was happening. But it was too late to stop. The train had picked up speed and was hurtling toward the abyss. "Stand up. Court is in session," announced the bailiff. Judge Bridges entered the courtroom, a gray-haired man with shrewd eyes and a stern expression. He took his seat, looked around, and nodded to the clerk. The session began. Judge Bridges opened the file and scrutinized its contents. There was silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the rustling of papers. I could feel the tension in the air becoming almost palpable. Everyone present realized the importance of the moment. "So," said the judge, raising his eyes from the papers, "case number 2024, fraction 743. The plaintiff is Casper Drake against the defendant Cordelia Crane. The subject matter of the action is the invalidation of property transactions made by the defendant in a state where he could not understand the meaning of his actions." The judge's voice was even and impartial. Robert Bridges was famous for the fact that he never showed his emotions in the courtroom and made decisions solely on the basis of the presented facts and legislation. I now give the floor to the plaintiff's representative, Attorney Gerald Hawkins. Casper and Thelma's attorney rose from his seat. He was a man about 45 years old, tall and lean, with sharp facial features and penetrating brown eyes. Gerald Hawkins was known in Lipsick legal circles as a ruthless professional who never stopped short of using questionable methods to achieve victory. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge, "today we are hearing a case that concerns the defense of an elderly man's interests against his own reckless actions. My client, Casper Drake, had to go to court not out of malice, but out of love and concern for his 70-year-old grandmother." Hawkins spoke convincingly, with just the right intonation. There was not an ounce of falsity in his speech, as if he really believed that he was protecting the interests of a helpless old woman from her own stupidity. "Cordelia Crane," the lawyer continued, "is an elderly woman who, due to natural cognitive decline, can no longer adequately assess the consequences of her financial decisions. Over the past year, she had committed a series of acts that were causing her only relative serious concern." I looked at Casper. My grandson was sitting with his head down, carefully avoiding meeting my eyes. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. It was obvious that every word of the lawyer hurt him, but he did not dare to stop what was happening. "What are these actions?" Hawkins asked, pausing for dramatic effect. "First, Mrs. Crane changed her will, disinheriting the sole heir, her grandson, from the family estate. Instead, she had given it to an unknown charitable organization." Thelma sat next to her husband, a poorly concealed joy written on her face. She listened to the lawyer's speech with the expression of a person watching the performance of a long-awaited play. From time to time, she nodded, supporting particularly successful arguments from her point of view. "Secondly," Hawkins continued, "Mrs. Crane flatly refuses to consider reasonable offers to move to more suitable housing for her age. She stubbornly remains in the large house, which requires significant maintenance costs and could pose a danger to a single elderly woman." The attorney walked around in front of the judge's table, gesturing and raising his voice at appropriate moments. He was an experienced public speaker and knew how to impress the court. "Third, Mrs. Crane's behavior in recent months shows signs of paranoid sentiments. She accuses her family of self-serving motives, refuses to accept help, and behaves aggressively and inappropriately." I felt the blood pounding in my temples. Each accusation was a misrepresentation of the facts, but Hawkins presented them so convincingly that they would seem plausible to someone unfamiliar with the real situation. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, stopping in front of the judge's table, "we are not asking that Mrs. Crane be declared totally incompetent. We are asking the court to invalidate her recent decisions made under the influence of age-related mental changes and to appoint a guardian to manage her financial affairs." Thelma could barely to keep from laughing with pleasure. I could see her mentally managing my house, selling it, and spending the proceeds on her own needs. There was a light of greed in her eyes that she no longer tried to hide. Who is proposed for the role of guardian? The judge asked. Casper Drake, Mrs. Crane's only relative, is willing to assume that responsibility, Hawkins replied. He loves his grandmother and wants only the best for her. Casper jerked as if he had been struck. He cast a quick glance at Thelma, then lowered his eyes again. I realized that my grandson had no idea he was going to be appointed guardian. It was Thelma's idea, who thus wanted to gain control of my finances through my husband. We have witnesses ready to corroborate Mrs. Crane's inappropriate behavior, the lawyer continued, as well as the report of the psychiatrist who examined the defendant at our request. When was this examination conducted? Judge Bridges asked. Last week, Your Honor. Dr. Phillips, a well-known expert in geriatric psychiatry, interviewed Mrs. Crane and prepared a detailed report. I remembered that visit. An unfamiliar middle-aged man came to my home, introduced himself as a doctor, and said he was conducting a survey of elderly residents in the neighborhood for a quality-of-life study. I agreed to talk to him, thinking it was a sociological survey. But it turned out that I had been duped, and the doctor was working for Casper and Thelma's side. Dr. Phillips's report states, Hawkins read from the sheet, that Mrs. Crane shows signs of mild dementia, paranoid tendencies, and a decreased ability to critically evaluate situations. He recommended guardianship of the patient to protect her best interests. Thelma couldn't hold back a satisfied smile. She leaned over to Casper and whispered something in his ear. My grandson shook his head, but his wife persisted. Apparently, she was already making plans on how to sell the house and get the money as quickly as possible. Now let me present the witnesses to the court, Hawkins said. I call first Mrs. Crystal Robinson, a friend of the family. Thelma's red-haired friend rose from her seat and made her way to the witness chair. She was dressed brightly and provocatively in a pink dress with a deep neckline and high-heeled shoes. Crystal took the oath and sat down, crossing her legs and defiantly adjusting her skirt. Mrs. Robinson, Hawkins began his questioning, how long have you known the Drake family? About 5 years, Crystal answered with a fake smile. I've been friends with Thelma since she married Casper. Have you had any contact with Mrs. Crane? Oh, yes, Crystal rolled her eyes theatrically. Unfortunately, I have. The woman is unbearable, always suspicious of everyone's motives, rude, spoiled child. I clenched my hands into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. Wayne put his hand on my shoulder, reminding me not to react to provocation. Can you give me specific examples? The lawyer asked. Sure. Crystal was clearly relishing the opportunity to smear me in front of the court. Last week I ran into her at the supermarket. I tried to say hello, and she came at me with accusations that I was trying to steal her money, yelling at the whole store that everyone was a crook and a thief. It was an outright lie. There was no meeting at the supermarket. The last time I saw Crystal was at Casper's wedding, but she was so convincing, she could have misled the court. And what about her relationship with her family? Hawkins continued. It's just awful, Crystal said with a shrug. Poor Casper and Thelma go out of their way to help the old lady, and she just gets angry and accuses them of all sins. Says that Thelma wants to take over her house, that they plan to kill her. Utter nonsense. Thelma nodded, supporting her friend's every word. She looked at me with a triumphant look, as if to say, well, do you see what an inadequate old woman you are? One last question, Hawkins said. In your opinion, is Mrs. Crane capable of making intelligent decisions about her property? Absolutely not, Crystal answered emphatically. She lives in her own world. She doesn't understand reality. If you don't help her, she'll do something so stupid that she'll lose every penny she has. The witness returned to her seat, satisfied with the effect she had produced. Thelma nodded approvingly, but Casper still sat with his head down, as if trying to hide from what was happening. Casper and Thelma's neighbor, a man named Ronald Schmidt, was called as the next witness. He talked about how Mrs. Crane was allegedly coming to their home at inappropriate times, acting strange and aggressive. Again, this was all false. I had never been to their home or interacted with their neighbors. Then Dr. Phillips, a psychiatrist, came forward and interviewed me under false pretenses. He spoke in dry medical language about age-related mental changes, declining critical faculties, and the need for external control over the financial decisions of the elderly. During my interview with the patient, the doctor said, I found signs of mild dementia, paranoid tendencies, and a diminished ability to adequately assess reality. Mrs. Crane demonstrates suspiciousness, a tendency to make unfounded accusations, and an inability to critically analyze her own actions. Thelma listened to this conclusion with barely concealed delight. She nodded several times, showing the judge that she fully agreed with the expert's opinion. Her eyes burned with the anticipation of an imminent victory. I recommend guardianship, the psychiatrist concluded. The patient needs protection from her own impulsive and rash decisions. Casper raised his head and looked at me. There was pain in his eyes, mixed with guilt. I could see that he was suffering from what was happening, but he could not stop the machine that his wife and attorney had set in motion with their combined efforts. This concludes the presentation of evidence on the plaintiff's side, Hawkins announced as he returned to his seat. Judge Bridges made a few marks on the papers and looked up. I now give the floor to the defendant. Wayne rose from his seat, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the center of the room. This was the moment of our defense, and the fate of the case largely depended on his skill. Thelma leaned back in her chair with a smug smile. She was certain that the game was already won, that the opposing counsel could not change anything. Her demeanor was that of a person who was already mentally calculating the profits. But she was not yet aware of the main trump card I had saved for the decisive moment. Wayne Parsons stood up and leisurely walked towards the center of the hall. His movements were calm and confident. For many years of practice, he learned not to show excitement even in the most difficult situations. The lawyer stopped in front of the judge's table and looked around at those present. Your Honor, he began in a measured voice, today we have witnessed an attempt to portray a caring and capable woman as a helpless victim of age-related changes. The plaintiffs are trying to convince the court that 70-year-old Cordelia Crane is incapable of making intelligent decisions. But the facts say otherwise. Thelma listened to his speech with a slight chuckle. She sat relaxed, glancing at her watch from time to time, as if bored with having to listen to formal objections. Her demeanor was full of confidence that no amount of defense argument could change the obvious outcome of the case. Mrs. Crane, Wayne continued, has undergone a full medical examination by independent specialists. The results show that she is of sound mind and sound judgment. Her decision to change her will was a conscious and deliberate one. The lawyer pulled medical certificates from a folder and handed them to the judge. Bridges scrutinized the documents, making notes in the margins. As for the so-called testimony, Wayne turned to the pews where Thelma's friends were seated. It is rife with inaccuracies and outright lies. Mrs. Robinson claims to have met my client at the supermarket last week, but Mrs. Crane can produce receipts showing that she shopped at a completely different place. Crystal fidgeted in her seat, and Thelma looked slightly worried for the first time during the session. She hadn't expected the defense to scrutinize witness testimony so thoroughly. In addition, Wayne continued, we have testimony from Mrs. Crane's neighbors who describe her as a reasonable and adequate woman. Mr. Walter Collins, who has lived next door for 10 years, is willing to testify that my client is perfectly capable of handling domestic matters and behaving in a perfectly normal manner. The judge nodded, taking note of this information. Thelma was beginning to show signs of nervousness. She was fiddling with her pen and furtively glancing at Attorney Hawkins. But most importantly, Your Honor, Wayne said, his voice steely, we would like to present to the court a document that completely changes the nature of this case. He turned to me, and I pulled out of my purse the folder I'd been saving for so long. Inside were photocopies of documents I had accidentally discovered 3 years ago. I'd hoped then that I'd never have to use them. Cordelia, Wayne said quietly, are you ready? I nodded and stood up from my seat. There was a tense silence in the room. Everyone present sensed that something important was happening. Even Judge Bridges leaned forward, watching intently. Thelma stopped feigning boredom. She was looking at me with growing concern, trying to figure out what document I was holding. Casper raised his head, too, and looked me in the eye for the first time in the entire trial. Your Honor, I said, turning to the judge, 3 years ago, I accidentally discovered information that sheds light on the plaintiff's true motives. My voice sounded firm, though my heart was racing. I opened the folder and took out the first document, the marriage certificate. This is the marriage certificate between Thelma Jenkins and Ricardo Martinez, I announced. The marriage was registered in Toledo on April 7, 2017. A collective sigh echoed through the room. Thelma turned pale as a sheet, and Casper stared at the document with an expression of utter bewilderment. It means, I continued, that at the time of her marriage to my grandson in 2019-19, Thelma Jenkins was already married to another man. Her marriage to Casper is null and void. Thelma jumped up from her seat. It's a forgery. Where did she get those documents? The judge banged his gavel. Order in the courtroom, please. Hawkins tried to object. Your Honor, the provenance of these documents is questionable. The documents are authentic, Wayne interrupted him. We have official certificates from the Toledo Registry Office confirming their authenticity. I pulled out the next paper. And this is a certificate that the marriage between Thelma Jenkins and Ricardo Martinez was not dissolved. The woman was still married at the time of her marriage to Casper. Thelma sank back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. All her self-confidence evaporated in an instant. Casper looked at his wife with an expression of confusion and pain. But that's not all, I continued. I have documents showing that Thelma Jenkins has been running a fraud for years. I pulled a printout from the police file. A statement Robert Fincher filed with the Akron police in 2015. He accused Thelma Jenkins of gaining his trust under the guise of a caring friend and then stealing $15,000 worth of jewelry from his home. Thelma raised her head, fury burning in her eyes. It's all lies. It's all lies. And this, I pulled out another document, is a complaint from Margaret Wilson of Dayton. Thelma Jenkins posed as a social worker, entered her home under the pretense of processing elderly benefits, and stole credit cards. Excitement began in the audience. Thelma's witnesses looked among themselves, some quietly heading for the exit. Crystal sat with her mouth open, clearly not knowing what to say. And finally, I announced, pulling out the last document, a statement from the Cleveland Police Department that Thelma Jenkins is wanted on charges of grand fraud. The document had the effect of a bomb going off. Thelma jumped up and tried to run out of the room, but the bailiff blocked her way. Let me go, she shouted. It's all a setup. The old witch forged the documents. Judge Bridges banged his gavel several times. Order! Order in the courtroom, please! Casper sat petrified. His face was white as chalk, his hands trembling. He looked at the woman he had lived with for 5 years as if he were seeing her for the first time. Thelma, he whispered, say it's not true. But Thelma was no longer pretending. The mask of the caring daughter-in-law had finally come off, revealing the true face of a professional con artist. Shut up, she shouted at her husband. Do you think I put up with your whining for 5 years out of love? I've been waiting for that old hag to die and vacate the house. The hall exploded with indignant cheers. Casper covered his face with his hands and shook with silent sobs. Thelma's friends hurriedly left their seats, not wanting to be associated with the unmasked criminal. I demand the immediate arrest of the suspect, Wayne addressed the judge. Thelma Jenkins is a federal fugitive, and her arrest is mandatory. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who approached Thelma with handcuffs. The woman tried to resist, but was quickly twisted. Let me go, she screamed. I didn't steal anything. It's all the imagination of an old mad woman. But it was too late. The documents I presented were irrefutable. Thelma's years-long scam had collapsed in an instant. Casper, she shouted as she was being escorted out of the hall. Don't leave me. We loved each other. My grandson did not raise his head. He sat bent over, as if he was under an unbearable weight. His whole life had fallen apart. His wife was a fraud. His marriage was invalid, and he was a pawn in someone else's game. When Thelma was taken away, there was an oppressive silence in the room. Judge Bridges studied the documents for a long time, making notes. Finally, he looked up. In the light of the circumstances presented, this case takes on an entirely different character. It is clear that the suit was brought under the influence of a person who had a selfish purpose and used deceit to accomplish his ends. Hawkins tried to salvage the situation. Your Honor, my client was not aware of his wife's past. Mr. Drake, the judge turned to Casper. Raise your head. My grandson barely complied with the request. His eyes were red with tears, his face gaunt. Do you still insist on your claims regarding your grandmother's incapacity? Casper shook his head. No, Your Honor. Yeah, I want to withdraw the suit. In that case, Judge Bridges announced, the suit is dismissed. Mrs. Crane remains the rightful owner of her property. This court is adjourned. The bang of the gavel put an end to this ugly spectacle. Casper rose slowly from his seat and walked toward me with uncertain steps. His face was contorted with grief and shame. Grandmother, he whispered, forgive me. I looked at my grandson, that broken man who had lost everything because of his gullibility and blind love for an unworthy woman. Pity and just anger struggled in my heart. He had caused me much pain, but he had suffered no less. Justice had been done, but the price of this victory was too high. After the announcement of the court's decision, the hall slowly began to empty. People dispersed in groups, discussing what had happened in muffled voices. The sensation was complete. No one had expected such a turn of events. A case that seemed simple and predictable had turned into a real detective story with the exposure of a fraud. Casper was left standing in the middle of the hall, as if not understanding what to do next. His world had crumbled in a matter of minutes. The woman he had loved for 5 years turned out to be a professional con artist. The marriage he thought was sacred was invalid from the start, and he himself became a tool in the hands of a skilled swindler who used him to achieve her selfish goals. Lawyer Hawkins was hastily gathering his papers, clearly anxious to leave the courtroom as soon as possible. His reputation had been seriously damaged by his involvement in this case. Representing a con woman was bad for the image, especially when the fraud had been exposed in such a public and humiliating way. Mr. Drake, he turned to Casper, I need to talk to you about payment for my services. Casper turned to him with a blank stare. What? My fee, $12,000 for the case. Regardless of the outcome, you'll have to pay the legal fees. $12,000? My grandson interjected. But we lost. It doesn't matter. A contract is a contract. I could see Casper trying to comprehend the magnitude of the financial disaster. Court costs, attorney's fees, possible creditors' claims. All of this was hitting him at once. And then there was the apartment, for which Thelma had insisted on taking out a mortgage. Now he had to pay the mortgage alone. Thelma's friends had long since disappeared from the room, not wanting to be associated with an exposed criminal. Crystal had been among the first to rush for the exit as Thelma was led away in handcuffs. Apparently, the red-headed friend knew more than she'd shown in her testimony. Wayne Parsons came up to me with a satisfied look. Cordelia, that was a brilliant victory. When you told me about those documents, I knew they were important, but I didn't realize how dramatically they would change the course of the case. I hoped I'd never have to use them, I answered honestly. Casper is my grandson, after all, and I didn't want to ruin his life. But you didn't ruin it, the lawyer objected. You saved him from more serious trouble. Sooner or later, Thelma would have left him anyway, taking everything she could. Casper came toward us with slow, uncertain steps. His face was ashy gray, and his eyes read deep confusion. He looked like a man who had suddenly awakened from a long nightmare and couldn't figure out where he was. "Grandma," he said hoarsely, "can I talk to you?" Wayne tactfully stepped aside, giving us a chance to be alone. There was almost no one in the hall, just the janitor sweeping the trash between the rows of benches. "Speak," I said, sitting down on the audience bench. Casper sat down next to me, but not too close. There was a chasm between us, dug by years of deceit and mutual misunderstanding. My grandson was silent for a few moments, searching for words. "I was a blind fool," he said at last. "All these years. How could I not see who she was?" "Love blinds you," I answered without gloating, "especially when one wants to believe that one is loved. But you saw. You knew from the beginning that there was something wrong with her." "I'm older than you, Casper. I have more life experience, and I wasn't in love with Thelma." He grinned bitterly. "In love? I wonder if she felt anything for me. Or was it all a game from day one?" This question tormented him the most. Casper could accept the financial loss, the ruined career, the public shame. But the thought that 5 years of his life had been based on a lie caused him unbearable pain. "She may have had some feelings in the beginning," I said softly, "but greed was stronger." "12,000 to the lawyer," he muttered, "plus court costs, plus the mortgage on the apartment we were buying for two. I'm broke, Grandma. You'll find another job. Who'd hire me after a scandal like this? All the papers will be reporting on the trial tomorrow." Grandson tried to sue his grandmother's house, but it turns out his wife was a fraud. Great publicity for an engineer. Casper was right. It was a high-profile scandal, and in a small town like Lipsick, stories like this are memorable. He's gonna have a really hard time finding a job with local companies. "You could move to another town," I suggested. "Start over." "With what? I don't even have the money to move." He sat with his head down, and I could see how hard it was for him to realize his own helplessness. Casper used to think of himself as a successful man who was in control of his life. Now it appeared that for the past 5 years, he had been a puppet in someone else's hands. A police detective, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, entered the room. He approached us and introduced himself. "Detective Clark, Fraud Squad. Mr. Drake, I need to record your statement." Casper looked up. "What statement?" "You lived with the suspect for 5 years. You must have seen something that could help in the investigation of her other crimes." "I didn't know anything," my grandson said tiredly. "If I had, would I have filed this idiotic lawsuit?" "Nevertheless," the detective insisted, Any information could be important: her contacts, her habits, the places she visited. We have reason to believe that Thelma Jenkins is involved in a string of frauds in several states. Casper nodded mirthlessly. Good. I'll tell you everything I remember. The detective pulled out a notebook and began writing down the statement. Casper talked about life with Thelma, about her friends, about the trips she took without him. Gradually, a picture of a well-organized criminal enterprise was emerging. She often went to visit her sick aunt in neighboring towns. Casper said, I realize now that there was no aunt. She was looking for new victims. And the money? The detective asked. Where did she get the money to make expensive purchases? She said she won the lottery, or that she'd gotten an inheritance from a distant relative. I believed it. Every answer hurt him. Casper realized that he was not just a victim of deception, but an accomplice to crime, albeit unwittingly. His money, his house, his reputation, everything was used to cover up the fraudulent operations. By the way, the detective said, closing his notebook, the bank has already blocked all joint accounts, and the apartment has been seized as property acquired with criminal proceeds. Casper groaned. So I'm left with nothing? While the investigation is going on, yes. Then, perhaps, it will be possible to get something back. But it's a long process. The detective left, leaving us alone. Casper sat in silence, digesting the magnitude of the disaster. He hadn't just lost his wife and home, he'd lost his whole life. Grandma, he said quietly, I realize I have no right to ask, but can I stay with you tonight? At least until tomorrow. I have nowhere to go. I looked at my grandson, the broken man who had been my enemy that morning. He had hurt me a lot, humiliated me publicly, tried to rob me of my home and my independence. In all fairness, I should have turned him down and left him to deal with the consequences of his actions. But Casper was the only family I had left. No matter what, he was the grandson I'd raised and loved, and he needed help now more than ever. You can stay, I said, but with conditions. What conditions? No trying to control my life, no talk of selling the house or moving, and no lying, just honesty. Casper nodded without looking up. Deal. We got up and headed for the exit. Wayne Parsons was waiting for us in the hallway with the last formalities. The case was officially closed. My rights to the property were confirmed. The suit was dismissed in full. What will you do next? The lawyer asked. Move on, I replied, just as I had planned. It was drizzling outside, just like in the morning, but now the weather seemed less gloomy. Justice had been served, albeit at a high cost. Thelma had gotten what she deserved, and Casper had learned a lesson that would probably do him good. We got into Wayne's car, who agreed to give us a ride home. Casper was silent the whole way, staring out the window at the rainy streets of Leipzig. I could tell he was rethinking his life, trying to figure out how he'd gotten to this point. When we pulled up to the house on Maple Street, Casper stared at the familiar building for a long time. This is where he spent the best years of his childhood. Here he was loved and protected from all adversity. And today, he tried to take this house away from me. Thank you, Grandma, he said as we walked down the hall, for not abandoning me today. Family is family, I said, even when it hurts. Casper made his way to his old room, which had remained untouched all these years. I heard him close the door and cry quietly. The 37-year-old man cried like that 12-year-old boy who had once lost his parents. But that was only the first night after the disaster. Ahead of us were many months of rebuilding broken relationships and trying to build a new life on the wreckage of the old one. I woke up at 6:30 in the morning, as usual. It was still dark outside the window, but my body was used to this mode for many years of loneliness. The rain had stopped during the night, and now I could see the first glimmers of dawn behind the glass. The November morning was cold and clear. I got out of bed and listened to the sounds of the house. It was quiet. Casper was probably still asleep in his nursery. Yesterday had worn him out physically and emotionally. No wonder he slept until late morning. Going down to the kitchen, I put the kettle on and sat by the window with a cup of coffee. The garden behind the glass looked bleak, with fallen leaves lining the paths, the chrysanthemums almost in bloom, the bare branches of the apple trees swaying in the wind. But in this autumnal picture was its own beauty, melancholy and peaceful. Yesterday I won in court, defended my home, my right to live independently, exposed a fraud. Justice had been served, as they say in the old books. But why did it feel so hard? I thought about what had happened over the years. Casper was a good boy, kind and helpful. I raised him with love, tried to give him the best. But somewhere I made a mistake. Maybe I overprotected him from the hardships of life. Maybe I didn't teach him the difference between sincerity and falsity. That's why he fell so easily for a professional con artist. Thelma turned out to be exactly what I thought she was from the beginning, a calculating, unscrupulous woman who saw in people only a source of income. For 5 years, she systematically prepared the ground for the seizure of our family property. She used Casper's love and trust, manipulated him, turned him into a tool to achieve her goals. But the most painful part was that my grandson let her do it. He chose his wife over his grandmother, greed over family ties, other people's interests over his own conscience. Though I realized he was being manipulated, the fact remained that Casper had tried to rob me of my home and my independence. At 8:30, I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. Casper was awake. He came into the kitchen a few minutes later, unshaven, in crumpled clothes, his eyes red from sleep. He looked terrible. "Good morning, Grandma," he said quietly. "Good morning. Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, please." He sat down at the table across from me, and we were silent for a while. There was tension in the air, both of us realizing that yesterday's events had changed everything between us forever. "I called the police," Casper said at last. "I wanted to know what happened to Thelma." "What did they say?" "They sent her to the state penitentiary. They didn't set bail because she's too high a flight risk. Detective says it's a serious case. She's being charged with grand fraud in 4 states." I nodded, not feeling the least bit sorry. Thelma got what she deserved. It was a shame that she'd victimized not only Casper and me, but a lot of other people too. "What about the apartment?" I asked. "Everything is frozen until the investigation is over. The bank says I can sue to get my share back, but that will take months, maybe years." Casper looked like a man who had lost his bearings in life. He didn't know what to do next, where to live, how to make money. At 37, he was broke. "Did you call work?" I asked. "Last night. The boss said I'd better take an indefinite leave of absence till the scandal clears up." "So you're basically fired." "Yeah, although officially it's called a self-initiated suspension. The newspapers did run stories about yesterday's trial. Local journalists didn't miss the opportunity to sensationalize the story. Family drama in the courtroom. Grandson versus grandma. What was behind the disability lawsuit? Fraudsters reveal shocks lipstick. The headlines were full of the details of our story. "Grandma," Casper said, putting the paper aside, "I want to apologize. To you, to Grandpa's memory, to myself. What I did was unforgivable. Apologizing won't change what happened. I know, but I still have to say it. I was blindly selfish, letting Thelma brainwash me, believing her lies about you being incapacitated. Casper was being sincere. I could feel it. But sincerity didn't erase the pain of betrayal. It didn't restore the trust that had been broken. Why did you trust her more than you trusted me? I asked. We'd known each other your whole life. You'd only known her for 5 years. He was silent for a long time, searching for words. I don't know, probably because I wanted to believe her. She was beautiful. She said the things I wanted to hear. And, she convinced me that you needed protection. Protection from what? Loneliness, trouble at home, trouble in the future. Thelma said that older people often don't realize their true needs. And you believe you know my needs better than I do? Casper blushed. It sounds terrible when you say that, but at the time, I thought we were taking care of you. Taking care of my money, you mean? No, I mean, I really thought I was doing good. Thelma was very convincing. I raised my hand to stop him. Stop. There's no need for explanations. What's done is done. We finished our coffee in silence. Then Casper went upstairs to pack. He was going to go away. Where to, I didn't know yet. Maybe to an old friend in a neighboring town. Maybe just to wander around until he found a job and a place to live. I stood alone in the kitchen and looked out the window again. My neighbor Walter was sweeping leaves in the yard. When he saw me, he waved and gave me a thumbs up, apparently reading the morning paper and approving of the outcome of the trial. Casper came downstairs with a bag in his hand. He stopped in the doorway as if he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. Grandma, he said at last, can I call you once in a while? Just to see how you're doing. You can, I answered after a pause, but not too often. And if you need help, I won't. He nodded and headed for the exit. He turned around at the door. I'm really sorry about what happened. I really am. I'm sorry too, Casper. I'm sorry about a lot of things. The door closed, and I heard the sound of footsteps moving away. Then a car started up. Casper must have called a cab. After another minute, the house fell into its usual silence. I walked through the rooms, as if checking to make sure everything was in order. The living room with its fireplace and antique armchairs. The dining room with the oak table where we'd once dined as a family. The study with the safe that held the documents that had saved my house. Casper's nursery, where he'd spent 10 years of his life. Everything was in place, but the house seemed different. It was as if its soul had gone, only a shell remained. The walls remembered the laughter and voices of people who were no longer there. Alfred had died 10 years ago. Casper was gone forever, not physically, but emotionally. The bond between us had broken, and there was no way to heal that wound. I went up to the bedroom and pulled a photo album from the dresser. I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures of happy days. Here was Casper at 5, joyful and carefree. Here he was at 10, a serious schoolboy with a briefcase. There's the graduation, the wedding, the family celebrations. Where is the boy I raised? When did he turn into a man capable of betrayal? Maybe the change didn't happen in 5 years with Thelma, but much earlier. Maybe I just hadn't noticed my grandson drifting away from me, becoming a stranger. In the evening, I sat in the living room by the fireplace, reading a book. Outside the windows, the November darkness had fallen. The streetlights were on. The house was quiet and peaceful, as it had been in the old days. But now this silence was different. Not peaceful, but empty. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was Mrs. Fleming's neighbor from across the street. Cordelia, dear, she said excitedly. I read in the paper about the trial. How are you feeling? I'm all right, Dorothy. Justice has been done. My God, that Thelma was such a bastard. And poor Casper, he must be so worried. I agree. Where is he now? Is he staying with you? No, he's gone. For good? Yes, completely. Dorothy was silent for a moment, trying to understand what was behind my short answers. Cordelia, if you'd like company, you're welcome to drop in. Or I could come to you. Thank you, darling, but I'm fine alone. After we talked, I turned off my cell phone. I didn't want to discuss what had happened, answer any more questions, explain my decisions. Everything was said yesterday in the courtroom. Late that night, I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the dark garden. The house on Maple Street was still mine, the way it had always been. I didn't have to sell it or move into a nursing home. I retained my independence and my dignity. But the price of that victory was high. I no longer had a family. Casper technically remained my grandson, but emotionally we had become strangers. Trust was broken, love poisoned by betrayal. I didn't regret what I did. I presented documents, exposed the fraud, protected my rights. Any man in my position would have done the same thing. But that didn't make it any easier. Tomorrow a new life would begin. A lonely but honest one. No lies, no attempts at control, no other people's greed. I'll live in my house, tending my garden, reading books by the fireplace, just as I had planned before Thelma interfered in my life. The house belonged to me, but there was no family in it anymore, and that was the most painful truth in my victory.